Good afternoon. We will start this symposium on science, diplomacy, meet health diplomacy. My name is Eduardo Krieger, and I am immediate past president of the Brazilian Academy of Science, and it's a great honor for the Brazilian Academy of Science and the University of São Paulo be the co-host of this symposium with Imperial College and the Global Health Europe. To start this symposium, maybe I can introduce a few words about the meaning of some words about what is diplomacy for science, what is science in diplomacy, or what is science for diplomacy. There is a report in 2010 from the Royal Society suggesting three dimensions of this area. One is diplomacy for science. It's the diplomacy that is a mechanism for advancing a scientific goal, particularly when there is extensive and expensive research program, and also when there is several countries or multiple countries involved in the program. Example may be the nuclear physics program that involves many nations, and it is very expensive. And also eradication of certain infectious disease need to also to put diplomacy to arrange all the program together. Second dimension is science in diplomacy. That this science is necessary for conduct or diplomacy or to inform issue of diplomatic concern. This is so the knowledge of science that the diplomat and the diplomatic institution need to have to understand science and, of course, to negotiate with the other nation subject that is from global interest, for instance, global warming or dietary factors for non-communicable disease. And the third dimension is science for diplomacy or science diplomacy. That is one of the areas that we will explore more today. And this area is the science as a mechanism for enhancing or building bridge between countries. So this science that usually play the role as a diplomatic instrument to make the relation between nations, to make contribution, multilateral agreement. And this is an area that we need to analyze today. Is not only the science diplomacy, but also the health diplomacy and what are the relation between the two and how they can interact. In this regard, I want to mention my own experience, that is the role of the academic community, the academies. Since 1931, we have a international institution that is called ICSO, is International Council for Science, that is represented, national countries is represented there, and also the unions, the different unions of science are represented in ICSO. And they have a long experience in doing science diplomacy, making the collaboration between countries, enhancing the collaboration between countries. Myself, I was president of COSTED, that was a committee of ICSO for science and technology in developing countries. The secretary was in Chennai, in India. So this is to illustrate that this area of science diplomacy for the international community is a subject that has been explored for many, many decades and with, I believe, some success. And then I may mention in this context the role of TWAS, this Third World Academy of Science that now is called the World Academy of Science for developing country, that is also very active, especially making the cooperation south to south, and of course south to north, but especially trying to make the collaboration between south and south. And now I will mention, because we have here the co-chair of AEP that will talk in this meeting, Professor Welker Melling, is the role of the academies. They were playing in ICSU, but since 2000 in Kyoto, we start and inaugurate a new network of the Academy of Science that we call IEP, Inter-Academy Panel for International or International Network of Academies. And also in Tokyo, we create the International Council, that is the executive part of the academies. In this IEP, we have around 100 academies. In this council, we have a few academies that the headquarters is in Amsterdam. For IEP, the headquarters is in Trieste. And also we create at that time the IMP, the Inter-Academy Medical Panel. So now I can talk a little bit about the experience of these two entities, the IAP, the Academy of Science, and the Academy of Medicine. And for several reasons that is not necessary or is not, there is no time to discuss, the Academies of Science, they have very good experience in international collaboration. Maybe because science is an international enterprise since the beginning. The scientists need to have collaboration because now more and more science is interdisciplinary, is inter-countries also. So this role of the academy is playing the international collaboration is very well explored for a long, long time. More recently is the role of the medical academies. Even if health is part of the science in the Academy of Science, health, because of its importance, of his the dimension of science in each health in each country, there is some separation between the scientists as a whole and the scientists that do research in health. So this is because we have academies of medicine and Academy of Science, even if the Academy of Science has some section of health science. This is to see that, to mention that is necessary nowadays, and I do hope Meller will in more detail and more properly address, is the convenience to not separate the role of the academies in science diplomacy and health diplomacy. They are together. They need to be together. And health diplomacy, at least for the academies, need to learn a little bit more about the experience of Academy of Science. So this is my word of introduction, is to say that we are now in a process of using all our power in the Academies of Science, in the Academy of Medicine, to really use our potentialities and our connection to enforce this science diplomacy, but especially now health diplomacy. And I believe now I can give the floor to my colleague, Stephen Matling, that will present the other speakers, because we have no only speakers from the area of academy, but we have several other actors that are playing important role in this area, institution, even the private sector. It is up to you, Madeline, to present our colleagues.
Thank you, Eduardo. Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to be co-chair of this afternoon's session on Science Diplomacy Meets Health Diplomacy. And let me pick up the threads from Eduardo, who's already referred to this seminal publication by the Royal Society in 2010, and its emphasis on three dimensions of the relationship between science diplomacy, between science and diplomacy: diplomacy for science, science in diplomacy, and science for diplomacy, sometimes just known as science diplomacy. And as Eduardo has illustrated, this is a relatively mature field in a way. It's been going for some time and there are rich experiences in it. And what has been remarkable has been, more or less during about the last 10 years, the very rapid rise to prominence of this field of health diplomacy, which is in many ways to be seen as just one aspect, one element of the larger field of science and diplomacy, but which nevertheless maybe has some special characteristics of its own, but also needs to learn a great deal from the broader field, as Eduardo has again emphasized. But there's been this remarkable and sudden rise of the field of health diplomacy. Perhaps just one very recent signpost to that has been a remark by the WHO Director General, very emphatically saying in this year's Executive Board, health diplomacy works. So this is something that's very decisively arrived on the international stage. I would, as antecedents to that, like to point to two very important papers by Ilona Kickbush and her colleagues, published in 2007, which began to pick out the importance of this emerging then field of health diplomacy and the need to have a better understanding of the issues and also a better training in skills and a better training for diplomats in how to use this field. Last year, she and a colleague wrote a kind of revisit and review of what had happened over the previous 5 years, which was published earlier this year in the WHO Bulletin, and which points to some of the reasons for this very rapid and emphatic ascent of the field, especially of global health diplomacy. I won't go through these in detail. You can all find the paper if you're interested in the details, but very briefly emphasizing the way that foreign affairs ministries are becoming more and more involved in health and health issues, the fact that venues of health diplomacy are expanding beyond the traditional health areas and into many global and regional blocs that normally deal with broader or other political issues, the way that globalization and new relationships are evolving and how this is impacting on the field of health diplomacy, and also the way that competent health diplomats are now needed more than ever and more broadly, and the older methods of just fly-in, fly-out diplomacy are needing to be replaced by something much more permanent. So this is a field that's come to quite rapid prominence and has some very distinct facets to it. At the Global Health Programme at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, which Ilona Kickbush heads, global health diplomacy is a major area of endeavour, and this includes the role of that centre in developing case studies and as a training centre for a whole range of people, including diplomats who need to be involved. And there have also been recently a series of linked activities beginning to emerge. There's a paper in development on this theme of science diplomacy meets health diplomacy. Today's dialogue is part of the process of encouraging inputs and extending thinking. And a more extended version of the dialogue, an important event, will be the annual high-level symposium, which the Global Health Programme at GIDS is organising in Geneva on the 12th of November, and those of you who are able to are very cordially invited to join in that day's work as well. So this is part of today of a strand of dialogues, and as my co-chair has already emphasised, one of the things we're particularly interested in this dialogue is situating health diplomacy and science diplomacy together. of ensuring that we don't start to develop in completely different and independent directions, but that health diplomacy and science diplomacy do learn from each other. And I think it is a two-way learning that needs to be involved, and not just one picking up from the experiences of the other, but really trying to understand and build partnerships between those involved in the health field and those more broadly involved in the science field, including and especially the academies of science. So today's program, the speakers have been encouraged to think about 4 particular questions in developing their remarks, but they're each going to bring very different perspective to our discussions. But 4 key questions that we consider important are: how can science actors, including the academies, and key health actors, including the schools of public health and increasingly of global health, engage with one another? How are the increasingly complex negotiations around health issues best managed and conducted? How can diplomats be prepared and supported for their work in the field? And what are the values and principles that should inform science and health for diplomacy? And our speakers today come from some very different backgrounds. Each of them is going to give us a presentation, and there will then be time afterwards for discussion, first for a comment and then for discussion with the audience. So I shall introduce each of them in turn, and our first speaker today is Volker Termolen, and I'd like to invite him, if he wants to come here to the podium, or he can speak from there as he prefers. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to give a short presentation. I would like to tell you that about 2 years ago, the White House in the US asked the National Academy of Sciences in the US to convene a symposium on the topic Science for Diplomacy, Diplomacy for Science. And they invited a group of people all over the world to discuss this. And I can tell you I participated. It was a very interesting discussion of high intellectual value. But I think we are here to come down, not to discuss this, all possibilities. What is there? I will give you some example showing that diplomacy, in other words, politics, needs science. And I tell you, and you're all familiar with it, that of course the reason why politician needs advice from science, from the science community, is since we are faced with grand challenges. And you're familiar with the population increase. You are familiar with the rising demand on food and water security, energy security. You're now familiar with the climate change, and of course also with the global health problem. And I don't want to get into detail because this is common knowledge. And of course, I think one has to realize that the contribution of science and technology for the solving of grand challenges is really needed. And I think only science and technology will offer solutions to meet these challenges. We realize that science and technology and innovation was a major driver for improvement of global living conditions. Without these support, we would not have such a possibility of providing food at the present time for really the population on the globe. It helps, as you can see, also to provide energy. And you're familiar with all the sustainable energy development lately, which has really helped a lot. Of course, there's a technological process of innovation in all major areas of life. And it is important that so the scientific evidence is actually presented and is agreed upon. And as you have heard from Eduardo Krieger, I represent a network of World Science Academy. This is abbreviated IAP, and this consists of 106 academies which represent 106 countries, so a little bit more than the United Nations. And this has 2 arms. One arm is the Inter-Academy Council, consisting of 15 academies elected from the 106, and they are mainly giving science advice to policymakers. And a good prominent example is that after when the last IPPC report was presented, as you recall, there were a lot of discrepancy and discussions among societies in different countries, and Ban Ki-moon has approached us whether we would be able to give an analysis of the governance structure. And the other arm is the Inter-Academy Medical Panel. As you just heard, there are 70 academies, and they are mainly dealing with global health. And out of these 106 IAP academies, we have created networks of academies in regional areas. We have the Americas, the North and South America. These are abbreviated INS, as you see. We have the Asian National Academies, ASA. We have the African Academies, NASAC, and we have the European Academies representing the national academies of the EU member states, abbreviated ESAC. And when you see what is the role actually of these Academy of Sciences, certainly is to give advice. And can they do it? We believe it, because if you see these networks, they represent the best science in the continent where they are located. They have really access to all areas of science, getting excellent people. And these national academies do have already experiences in giving advice to national governments. And the networks, and I will give an example of it, like ESA is giving advice to, let's say, in Europe, to the EU Commission and EU Parliament. And it is obvious that if one does it, then certainly one is the question, in what way do we do this? So I would give you an example of the European Academy Science Advisory Council, which is located here with the headquarters at the Leopoldina, my academy in Halle. And as I mentioned already, there are 24 academies. And they give advice in the area of energy, in the area of bioscience, and in the area of environment. And bioscience includes also some aspect of health. And the way we give advice is either that we do horizon scanning and pick up topics of relevance to society and policymakers. I will give you some examples soon. Or otherwise, we are approached by the EU Commission or EU Parliament to help for certain questions which they feel they could get independent advice from us. So what are the topics we have dealt with recently? You see, they are planting the future crop genetic improvement technologies. We have picked up the hot topic of GMO in Europe, and you all know that this is very emotionally actually handled. And we made an analysis over the last 20 years of GMO worldwide. We analyzed the situation in Europe. We analyzed what is the impact of Europe, the decision, the regulatory decision made in Brussels and in Parliament, to the African market, to the African situation. And we also analyzed the situation, for example, in the South Americas and Asia. And this document we presented to the EU Commission in Brussels. We had a scientific meeting too. And at the same time, when we presented this, Nature wrote an article about what we presented. And I would tell what is our major message, that it is very important that one should not regulate technologies, that one should regulate the product. If you look into the pharmaceutical industry, if you would regulate the technology in the pharmaceutical industry, which they use to have new products, we would not get any new drugs. We would not get any new medication. That would be the end. In the green technology, we do it the other way around in Europe. And if you look what happened worldwide, I think it is time to reconsider in politics, to discuss with society, and find a way in which we can actually cope with the future. And this is one typical example. We have made a statement on carbon capture storage and say, is it possible for Europe that we could have this technology or not? And we described the pro and the con. We have made an analysis of the situation of biofuels, bioenergy. And we did it for my academy, for Germany. We did it also for Europe. And I think we pointed out that if you want to have really bioenergy, Europe has to import biomass from outside Europe, because the biomass in Europe is not available to have really bioenergy as politicians would like to have. So in other words, we are trying to define from a scientific point of view what is feasible, what we feel it is not feasible, and then it's up to the politician, of course, and the democratic system really to achieve it. And I'm quite often asked, because I was also president of ESAC, so how do you measure your success? And I can tell you, I always say, if a politician comes out after he has voted in parliament and tells me, if I would have known what you tell me now, I would have voted differently, then I made a mistake. If he then decides, although he knows scientific background, differently, it is of course democracy, that's fine. That's the way we operate our societies and how we live. So in other words, what we are trying is to provide science bases which we can discuss together and try to be as honest and independent as possible. And other systems is system approach to energy policy makers, or for example, addressing, of course, challenges of climate change, always specific questions which we feel we can analyze. And also one from the global health, direct-to-consumer genetic testing. That is, if you want to find out your genes in these days, you go to the internet, you buy for $1,000 a kit, and then you spit in for something and send it to the company, and that tells you whether you will get certain diseases or not. This we have analyzed, we have given advice to European Parliament, whether this is of clinical value or not of clinical value, and I cannot go into details. It only gives you some sort of experiences. But what we also do, and which I think is very important, that these statements which we discuss will be also commented, or we submit some sort of a short statement of our statements to high-impact journals, like Nature, like Science, like Lancet, like other specific journals. And these are either short or longer documents, and it's quite interesting to evaluate the impact. Number one is that the scientific community realize that what the academies are doing is worth to be published in a high-ranking journal, which for science is the level of acceptance. Number two is that politicians, although they do not read Nature, Lancet, and Science, if they realize that this is actually commented on or is be published there, then they tell you, well, it can't be too bad what you are doing, because your scientific community is actually picking it up and publishing this. So this is something quite valuable for us, and of course, for what we are doing in the academies, that when we approach our members in our academies, that they're realizing it is worth participating and not a waste of time. Okay, what are the audiences? European Commission, the European Parliament, Council of Ministers, Council of Europe, general public, scientific community. So in addition to these specific statements, we make short summaries, but also lay version. And we are asking science journalists to make a summary out of what we have written so that it is really distributed. And this is a quite successful way in which the information is really then presented to other areas of our society as well. So if we globalize the output from regional academies network, identifying opportunities, this is something which is the next step we certainly have to do. We in ESAC make only statements for Europe. NASAC makes statements for Africa. The Asian makes statements for Asia, and the Americas for the Americas. And what is not done yet, and this is what I would like to really push, is that out of these different areas, different opinion will come. If we take the example of bioenergy, then of course the bioenergy assessment of Europe, of Africa, of Asia, and America will be different. But out of this, we will find common denominator, we will find pro and con, and at the end we will have a document in which politics can realize what is different, what is common, what can be achieved, what cannot be achieved. And this, from my point of view, only can be assessed by networks which have a vast access to science and scientists, and not by individual committees. So, in conclusion, I hope I did not talk too long. It is the global grand challenges are relevant, also at the regional level. 80% of all decisions made in European Parliament have a science background. We have to work together. IAP, the network I represent as co-chair, is very interested to bring all these networks together and give global advice. And I think it is an attitude, or let's say, or an exercise which for me is a lot of interest, because one learns from politics also how difficult it is to come to a common conclusion and come finally to a decision which is helpful in the interest of all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Volker, for those remarks. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Peter Piot, currently the Director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and former Executive Director of UNAIDS.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Good evening, everybody. I don't have a PowerPoint, which is always a pleasure. What I'm going to say, some of it has been said also by my good friend Michel Kazachkin, because I will deal with AIDS as a case study for what's now called health or science diplomacy. And as in a recent paper by health historian Alan Brand in the New England Journal of Medicine was said that the title was How AIDS Engendered Global Health. Global health is a term that actually only appeared around the millennium, the change of the millennium. And I think that a lot of what we're doing today in terms of involving diplomacy and so on into health and science politics can be traced back to AIDS. Although already in the 19th centuries there were international agreements that had to do with health, so it's not completely new. But it was science that was really a game changer in terms of the history of the AIDS epidemic, when antiretroviral therapy was shown to treat HIV infection and prevent actually death. That happened in 1996. And it is science that offered then the, in essence, and ironically, the political, opened the political gates. And the AIDS movement was really driven by two things. It was founded into two legs. One was the science, because there were many fights about what works, because it was associated with sex and drugs. So we were easily getting into the moral discourse and so on, and prejudices. And on the other hand, grounded in human rights. These were the two legs. And let me now say a few points what I believe what happened over the last 15 years, particularly after the discovery and the introduction of antiretroviral therapy, at least in high-income countries. And that the fact that the majority of people could not benefit from that treatment was an incredible driver of this movement. And early on, certainly for me, it was clear that the World Health Assembly and the then existing and still existing fora for global health politics were useless, to say the least, if not counterproductive, because they were too narrow, no power, conservative, and were not really connected with really where the power was in society. Finance, security, the economics, trade, and all that. And all these are shaping, actually, health to a far bigger extent often than the, certainly, medical community. And so, even today, I believe that we desperately need some multi-stakeholder forum on global governance of health, which cannot come only from the health sector. So, in terms of the late 90s, when we had not made any advance in the fight against AIDS, UNAIDS was created and so on, but not much progress was made. With a number of people, we really developed a radical political agenda and trying to put AIDS on mainstream global agendas. And that resulted in a number of in premieres and first events, such as the first debate on health in the UN Security Council was the first ever meeting of the new millennium on the 9th of October 2000. That was on AIDS in Africa, followed by a resolution, 1308, on health in peacekeeping operations, on AIDS in peacekeeping operations. The first ever full session and summit of the Organization of African Unity in Abuja in 2001, the first ever 3 days full special session of the UN General Assembly on the health issue was also on AIDS. So that this was kind of the the result of a deliberate strategy. And in addition, there were a number of champions that came up on the national sides. And I would like to single out Brazil, where today any Brazilian ambassador knows about access to drugs, TRIPS, the relationship between AIDS and health issues and other mainstream agendas. And that was a deliberate political choice which went across party lines. It started with Fernando Henrique Cardoso from another party than the current government. So let me highlight 5 points that were partly driven by science, partly driven by health, but, and I'll come back to what I think was what it actually was driven to. First of all, there was the fight for specific financial and delivery mechanisms, which people who are into health systems hate, but in the end they had impact. So through the creation of specific institutions, UNAIDS, but particularly the Global Fund, and then on the bilateral side, PEPFAR. So specific in institutions. Secondly, was to ensure access to global goods, to innovation. In other words, to antiretroviral drugs who were still under patent, and where it normally takes until the end of the patent before such drugs are available to people in low-income countries when they can access to generic drugs. So that was a matter of reducing the price and introducing generic competition. Thirdly, was to demonstrate that it's possible. Particularly when you want to put something on an agenda and you need to demonstrate that it's just not a pipe dream, but that it's feasible. And so therefore, a number of demonstration projects conducted by NGOs, such as Médecins Sans Frontières, but also UNAIDS, showed that it is possible to introduce a fairly sophisticated technology, such as antiretroviral therapy, into a resource-poor environment. Fourth was that we had to change the rules of the game, and particularly when it comes to TRIPS, to the trade-related intellectual property, so that there would be exceptions for public health reasons to provide generic versions of drugs that are still under patent. And that happened in Doha in 2001. And lastly, I would say that what was key was, in a sense, what Matubani also, Professor Matubani mentioned in the opening session, is we had a kind of post-Westphalian approach. It's something that a political scientist told me, and I had to look it up what that means. But it was really a coalition of transnational civil society groups that were not so concerned about state sovereignty and were involved in this kind of global movement. And all this gave results, and I think it gave really birth to various aspects of global health. Now, was this science or was this health diplomacy or both? I never looked at it that way. It was really a global movement for social justice and for survival. And I'm really very happy that the academies, and I'm a member of some of them, are now engaging in this. But in these days, they were absolutely silent. There was no voice from the organized medical community, scientific community that was speaking up for this unfolding disaster. And so I think we have learned some lessons. Then my last few points is that when we talk about diplomacy, and because diplomacy can be internal in a country, but also internationally usually, what can be the drivers? I mean, it can be a moral driver, and I think that is definitely can be very strong when it comes to health. In science also, but it can be counterproductive. I mean, I think that the example of GMOs is a bad example, but it's a sad example where there is a very strong moral component, but that's where civil society comes in. Secondly, there's the soft power aspect, that's for sure. But also sometimes that science and health diplomacy can keep channels open that are closed. I remember in the days of negotiations around you know, the price of antiretroviral drugs, of creating the Global Fund. There was Cold War, to say the least, between the United States, the Bush administration, and the UN. You remember Iraq. But the channels were still open on the health field and also around AIDS. And that's also an aspect that we've seen quite a few times. Thirdly, let's not forget that it's often about commercial and trade interests and about innovation. And we can wish that away, but it will be there, and that will lead to really power struggles. Fourth, there are, of course, real global challenges that cannot be addressed by within the borders of one country. Pandemics are one of them, climate change, and Volker mentioned quite a few. And lastly, I would say that there is a desire and a fight to be part of the global knowledge economy, which is also, I think, a driver for this science and health diplomacy. So for our agenda, I think, finally, where I stand, I would say that science policy is not only an issue for international diplomatic policy, but take the UK, every single department, government department, has a chief scientific advisor. It has to start in every single department, not only in foreign affairs or what. So, and that the job of these people is to make sure that at the least decisions and policy decisions are not going against scientific evidence. Secondly, I think that when we talk about the international arena and also a constellation of high-income countries, middle-income countries, low-income countries, and so on, it's about time that research and innovation and also higher education become part of the international development agenda, where it is not there. It is still seen as kind of a luxury type of thing, and not as important as primary and secondary education and other elements that ensure a country. And finally, I think those, as a scientist, I would say we need to be also a bit humble. We don't have solutions for everything. We are sometimes the worst enemies of introducing science. When I was head of UNAIDS, the scientists would come to me with the first thing they would say was badmouth some other scientists, and there was no unified perspective. And that's fine in academia. That drives progress. But when you go with a divided opinion from scientists to policymakers, we have no chance. So bringing together kind of some consensus is important, and also realizing that that policy should be evidence-informed, but not necessarily, for me, evidence-based. Because if it's only evidence-based, we eliminate values such as human rights, such as gender equity and all that, and these are societal choices. And so we, as scientists, we also need to accept that and see that how we can move within that framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Our next speaker is Andreas Stam, who is currently Program Manager and of the National Quality Infrastructure Program for GIZ in Ethiopia. Andreas.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to thank the organizers of this World Health Summit, the invitation to speak today. My name is Andreas Stam. I'm currently working in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, for GIZ, but this was not the reason to invite me, I think. But in my former life, I worked for around 15 years with the German Development Institute, think tank for the German government in development policies for international cooperation. And since I started to work with DIE in 1998, there was one issue that was driving my research agenda, and this is related to a concept that Peter just mentioned, the globalizing or global knowledge economy. So since I started to work in development research, I was driven by the question, what does this trend towards a globalizing knowledge economy mean for developing countries? Will they stay behind? Will they fall behind? Or is there a chance for catching up in this globalizing knowledge economy and society? And as a policy researcher, we also always ask the question, what can policies in the north and in the developing countries do to allow for this catching up? In the last years of my work with the German Development Institute, I worked in a very exciting project related to the topic of today. It's not about global health diplomacy, but about science diplomacy, even if we did not mention this in our project. We developed within the OECD Committee for Scientific and Technology Policy, CSTP, a book. It's called Meeting Global Challenges Through Better Governance, International Cooperation in Science, Technology and Innovation. It took us more than 4 years to publish this book. This shows that the topic of international collaboration is quite complex when it comes to science and technology. We mainly did 7 case studies related to a series of international and global challenges about agriculture and food, about energy provision, etc. And we followed a similar approach to all our case studies. We worked about agenda and priority setting, funding and spending arrangements, intellectual property, bridging research and practice, and finally capacity building for international cooperation. And this work was done in an international network of experts, and I was very happy that we did not only have OECD countries within the network, but also 2 of the so-called OECD enhanced engagement countries, namely South Africa and China. And it was very important to have these non-OECD countries on board. Mainly what I just projected, the challenges, is taken from the declaration of the World Scientific Forum in Budapest in 2011. This declaration said the growing complexity of grand challenges, including population growth, climate change, food supply, energy shortages, natural and technological catastrophes, epidemics and sustainability require that the world's scientific establishment assumes new roles. This was mainly the guiding question of our work within the OECD. It's quite easy to find potentials for that international collaboration in science and technology and innovation bring. First of all, what economists would name economies of scale and risk sharing. If we pool financial resources, it's easier to make large-scale infrastructure feasible. For example, in the field of carbon capture and storage technologies, was also mentioned in one of the speeches before. Very expensive research that can only be shouldered in an international collaborative effort. And also the risk sharing, because it's a very risky, still a risky technology that is not easy to bring to market. It also allows combining mainstream research and out-of-the-box thinking, so not only working in one direction, in what economists or innovation researchers would say path-dependent research, but combining this mainstream research with giving incentives for people to come up with completely out-of-the-box or innovative thinking. Shortening of the innovation cycle. We are all probably aware about the problem of climate change, and we all know that we have to come up with new solutions, for example, to energy generation in a rather short time. And if pooling of financial and intellectual resources can allow to reduce the time gap between research and development and commercial applications. I find it very interesting that many of the new biotechnological innovations of today are based on basic research from 50 years ago. I think taking climate change as one example, we can't just wait 50 years to come up with sustainable energy provision in a large scale. Economies of scope, and other terms that economists would use, it's just allowing or assuring that communication and cooperation among researchers allows for cross-fertilization of ideas and intermediate results, and, as I said before, to avoid path dependency. So these are the potentials, all very convincing, I think, and let's have a short look at the reality. And this was one of the figures that I was really surprised that came up in our research project. Even within the European Union, after more than half a century of efforts for cooperation and unification, around 85% of all public research and development is programmed, financed, monitored, and evaluated at the national level. So even within the EU, we have only 15% of R&D spending that is done in an internationally collaborative way. This is, I think, quite amazing, if not say shocking. This has a lot to do with the legitimacy of science, technology, and innovation policymakers. So the policymakers, they want to know what's in it for me or what is in it for us as a nation state that invests money in internationally collaborative research and development. It's also the so-called juste retour expectation, just return. So if a R&D policymaker goes for international collaboration, he or she wants to know that the money that the nation state is investing in international collaboration at least comes back to the own researchers and science and technology institutes. So we have a big problem with incentive systems, and yeah, so it's not easy. By now, international collaboration in science, technology, and innovation is clearly the exception and not the rule, but there are also some more promising results of our research. It can be shown that international collaboration enhances the so-called citation impact of scientific publications. So for a researcher who wants to publish in internationally recognized journals, it is a good idea to go for international collaboration because the publication will be cited more frequently than if he publishes on his own. This does not mean, of course, that this means international collaboration between developed and developing countries. It's mainly an incentive to search for other high potential researchers in developed countries. It's also a significant number of researchers willing to contribute to finding solutions to global challenges. I think perhaps the most impressive example is the already mentioned IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. These assessment reports, they are done in a huge international collaboration involving around 2,000 researchers, and these are so mainly volunteer researchers because they don't get paid for their work with IPCC. So I think we can see that researchers can also be motivated to go for international collaboration, even if it doesn't. It has not to do with just return for their efforts. We have not done very much work on life science and global health, but there are some interesting examples, and I think in life science, normative considerations and perhaps also normative pressures triggers philanthropic initiatives. First of all, to mention is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, mobilizes development cooperation, for example, the European and Developing Countries Clinical Trial Partnership, EDCTP, and innovative ways of public-private partnerships, such as patent pooling under WHO, for example. So I think compared to other international or global challenges, the global health situation is a little bit in a better condition as it has unique opportunities to mobilize scientific research, funding, and private sector involvement. If you compare it, for example, to many other of these global challenges, one of my always mentioned example is overfishing and contamination of oceans with long-lasting waste. There's actually no engagement in the international community to address this global challenge. And as a development researcher, I can tell you that there's already empirical evidence that the overfishing of fish stocks has led to an increasing poverty in small-scale coastal fisheries, and also to a reduced protein supply of poor population close to the coasts of the developing world. So there are global challenges that do not really receive the attention that they should receive. One issue that we found as very striking is that it's very promising if we can link international cooperation to a high-level mandate of international organizations. For example, the already mentioned IPCC that has a clear mandate from the UN Framework Committee on Climate Change, or for example, the Consultative Group of International Agrarian Research, group of 15 international agricultural research organizations that have received from the United Nations the mandate to protect the gene pools for many of the staple crops of this world. And this is a very important motivation for researchers to go for international collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. Our fourth speaker is Gary Nabel, who is Chief Scientific Officer and Deputy Head of Research and Development at Sanofi, based in the United States.
Thank you, Stephen. What I want to do is just touch on three topics which have already been addressed to differing extents already. One is the role of science in promoting goodwill globally. The second relates to the use of science in health diplomacy and how that actually happens. But what I really want to get to and leave as sort of the thinking point is this relationship between science and health diplomacy. And the question is whether we should really be continuing on with our current models of simply informing about health diplomacy, or whether we should be looking at it in a more dynamic and interactive way. Let me start with a couple of examples, because I think it helps sometimes to put things in human terms. I picked this first example of John Kennedy welcoming the Nobel laureates in the White House in 1962, not actually even thinking about his connection to this city. As you know, he came here 50 years ago, just months before his tragic death. And the year prior to that, in the White House, he welcomed the Nobel laureates from 1962, saying, "This is the most extraordinary collection of talent, of human knowledge that has ever been gathered together at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." There were two things that I thought were interesting about that remark and about this occasion. One is that sitting in the center of the picture here was probably one of the epitomes of scientific diplomacy, was Linus Pauling, who received the Nobel Prize in 1954 the first time for discovering the nature of the chemical bond, and in 1962 received the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in advocating against the nuclear test ban treaty. In fact, the day before he attended the reception at the White House, he was out picketing in front of the White House, not something that was appreciated necessarily by the administration. But it does, I think, embody the notion that individual scientists can be advocates for the greater good and can use their science and project it onto the needs of the world. The second has to do with the remark about Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson, in fact, was a remarkable polymath, a student of all things. Among them, he was an amateur scientist. And in fact, early in his career, he had learned how to administer the smallpox vaccine shortly after Edward Jenner had developed it in the late 1700s. What he then did, actually, in the White House in the United States, is that he taught Meriwether Lewis, the famous explorer of Lewis and Clark that went across the United States to discover the Pacific Ocean, and taught Lewis how to give the smallpox vaccine. The president himself taught this explorer to give the smallpox vaccine, which he did, to tribes of Indians who were suffering from smallpox as he went west. One of the first documented examples of scientific diplomacy. So when you see these examples, they can be, I think, both inspiring, but they can also be very concrete in terms of the good that they can achieve. And so I think we really need to look carefully at how we can use science in that regard. So here are the three topics that I've mentioned before: scientific discovery spanning international borders. And let me proceed to the first one quickly. And the reason that I think it is so important in terms of our overall approach to science is that the problems that we face really are international problems. Science is ecumenical. We choose to address scientific problems regardless of our religion, regardless of our color, regardless of our faith, regardless of our ethnicity. And in fact, it's that diversity that we bring globally to solve scientific problems that actually helps us solve them better. I'm going to point to one small example of where science has promoted diplomacy. It was in my own laboratory at the National Institutes of Health before I left last year to join Sanofi. This shows the composition of my laboratory, and you can see that we've had diverse members of the lab around the world. Our common scientific interest had been in vaccines, trying to develop universal vaccines for AIDS and influenza, again, diseases that I don't have to tell you about their global impact. In my laboratory, we had two individuals who were working side by side on the bench. One who was of Lebanese extraction, who was Islamic, who prayed 5 times a day, working side by side with a former Israeli army captain who was the son of Holocaust survivors. I can tell you I never heard a harsh word between them. I can tell you that they worked together and they had mutual respect and a strong working relationship. So at the person-to-person level, when we do science and we do it internationally, that is a form of diplomacy, because we know that those friendships and those relationships go beyond those short times in labs together. There are obviously many other forms of international collaboration. We have the WHO and CDC, Influenza Surveillance Network, 122 collaborating institutions, 94 countries. It doesn't stop there. We have examples in arthritis research that literally do span the globe. And I think that we need to remember that science in and of itself is worthy of the discoveries that it makes, but also worthy of the connectedness that it brings to our world. Now, I want to now focus a little bit on the value of human health and this notion that human health is universal and it does bridge the differences among cultures and societies. That's been said by almost every speaker up here. I won't say any more other than to show this picture, because I think this is the reason that Peter did what he did for so many years, why Michel does what he does. You don't need a description when you see what antiretroviral therapy can do to an individual inflicted with AIDS. This is an individual from South Africa before antiretroviral treatment was begun and after. And I think this is the reason, again, why our colleagues in Brazil made the initial efforts that they did to promote universal treatment with antiretroviral therapy. The G8 has recognized the importance of global health. It's now supporting programs in maternal and child health, childhood vaccine, and most recently dementia, again, problems that span every aspect of the life cycle and every culture around the world. But what I also want to do, and I should mention along these lines that we've talked about the different contributions of different organizations to this effort. Clearly the Academy is critical to advancement here. Government and diplomats are critical to the communication and the networking to implement these treatments. I would also argue, and this is now wearing my newest hat, that this cannot be done without the involvement of industry. Sanofi alone has a presence in over 100 countries around the world, but the most important thing clearly is that to really reach out and touch all of the individuals in these many countries, you need to be able to expand to the scale that's needed, and you also need that flexibility to work in different local environments. That's something that industry brings. It doesn't need to do it alone. In fact, it can't do it alone, but it's also an important component without which I think these problems won't be solved. And that leads to the last issue, which is that I think we have real challenges in front of us, and I think the major one is actually translating scientific discovery into implementation that benefits global health. There's a great example from another one drawn from the HIV field of a paper published 2 years ago from Mike Cohen and his group in the HPTN, the HIV Prevention Trials Network, where they showed in a paper published in the New England Journal that if you test and treat early with antiretroviral therapy, you can prevent greater than 90% of the transmission cases of HIV. That, together with mother-to-infant chemoprophylaxis, brings us the real probability of actually eliminating HIV infection in the next generation. We've known that for 2 years, but we've done very, very little in terms of actually moving that ball down the field. There are many good reasons for it, but I think the issue at the end of the day is this, that what we have is basically a real issue at the handoff between the advances in science and implementation. This is a slide I've taken from my colleague Tony Fauci at the National Institutes of Health, and I think this really hits upon a key point, that if we want to see science translate into improvements in public health, the science has to move, the implementation has to move, there has to be coordination between the two. And it's not simply a matter of science informing policy and diplomacy. In this case, it's actually a matter of science driving policy and diplomacy. And I think arguably in some of the other examples we heard about today, that may well be the case too. So I think it might be, and as examples of this, you know, the access to HIV prevention, the access even to treatment, even with programs like PEPFAR, we're not keeping up with the epidemic. So we really need to look at more aggressively at the way we do things. I've listed here some of the steps that I think we can take that would help. It's probably not complete, and I'm sure others in this room could add to it. Obviously, we need to continue doing the fundamental science, particularly in the diseases that have a high human health impact, where the economic incentives are not great to treat those diseases. We especially need to reach out to the public, because it's really the public that drives that will give the impetus to our political leaders in calling them to action. And I think the case of Brazil and the case of HIV may again be a very good example of that. We do need global champions with the fiscal resources. Even a country like the United States with the $15 billion a year that it puts into PEPFAR can't do that forever. We have to build partnerships. We have to think of sustainable solutions and using those fiscal resources wisely. Obviously, it requires public health infrastructure. And I think the last point that's been mentioned previously is that it's public-private partnerships and involvement of every sector that we heard about today, really working together, really pushing each other, and not being satisfied with the status quo. So I think that I'll leave you with those thoughts, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce now Ji Qiang. She is Director of School of Public Health, Fudan University, China, for her comments.
Thank you, Chair. I think today we got several experts give us very strong opinions about how science diploma meets the health diploma. So now whole world, health is a very important part of the country. They considering that. When I work in WHO, DG is Dr. Bruland. She raised a question is, and also have one project is about the macroeconomic and the health, because every country they need the people to work and to create a lot of economic development. So for the science diploma also involve a lot of health problem. So to improve the health, we need whole world collaborating together, and the whole world, for the interrelationship. So it means health diploma. It means how we can collaborating together to dealing with the health technology. So it is involved two aspects. One is health technology innovation. Another is how to apply this health technology for the country and make a policy. So it is also very important. For myself, I did a lot of work in the health technology assessment. I think for this health technology innovation, we need to assess how this technology is more useful and more economic money value, and also more, based in scientific, it really can help improve people's health and improve our society more productive. So, for example, I just recently got a project from WHO regular budget. The project is we want to do three things. Number one is how collaborating together. So first, in the national level, we want to form a network. And recently, we have the meeting in region, Philippines, Manila. We want to form a network with all the region countries get together. So collaboration is one of the key issues for the health diploma. And also, I think recently we just finished all these UN systems, including UNICEF, UNDP, WHO, and so on. They get collaborating together as one project is how to improve vulnerable women and child, their nutrition and food safety. So all these Beijing representative office, they get together and donate a lot of money, ask China have some kind of pilot study in 3 provinces in the very developing the township and county level, how to do a pilot study to build a model for the whole world in the future, how to get the vulnerable women and the children food safety and health and the nutrition. So all these things will ask the collaborating within the country and within the region and within the global level, and then we can get the most priority and the most experience to get the whole world improve their safety. So today, our experts give a lot of case study and give a lot of theory. So we want to move from the scientific diploma meet the health diploma. So I think want to thank you all your speakers. We can learn a lot from you. Thank you.
Thank you. To initiate questions and comments from the audience, it's my honor to ask Professor Ilyona to start, because she's considered a great expert in this area. Maybe she will comment about the program that he has. No? Okay. So, the microphone is open. I believe there are microphones there. Okay. Please. Give your name, and you can address the question for one of the speakers or for the...
Dr. Robert Sobag. It's not really a question, it's some comments. When we speak about diplomacy, it's relation between countries. And health is a tool of this diplomacy. I just want to give some example. If you take Cuba, it's a little island, 12 million inhabitants, and the majority of the diplomacy from Cuba is made through health and through the doctor. You have 36,000 Cuban doctors all around the world. And the main tool of the diplomacy of the relation between Cuba and some country is made by health and by the doctor. You have in Vietnam, Mozambique, Angola, Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador, many countries, and all the diplomacy is made by health. Even China, Madam Chen. It is sure that China, they want to expand the relation with the country, and in Africa, for example, China play with health. And the main cooperation from China in Africa is made by health. And we can say also United States, through PEPFAR and through PMI, President Malaria Initiative, it was also a very important tool in developing country and in emerging country. And I think it is very important. As you say, Gary, health is a universal value, and they have used health as a very important tool. Just it was some comments. Thank you.
Thank you. More questions, more comments? Please.
Hi, my name is Maria Bellarano, and I represent REACT, Action on Antibiotic Resistance. My question is for the general panel. Isn't it antibiotic or antimicrobial resistance one of the issues that should be tackled at a global level? And in terms of policy of what Dr. Piot said, I mean, it's also an issue of a Security Council. I mean, it's the largest security risk in health nowadays. But when you talk about antibiotics or antimicrobial resistance, we also have to tackle all the issues of intellectual property right and PDPs. So how can this great group of global diplomacy think also to put in the agenda of issues to tackle antimicrobial resistance? Thank you very much.
Thank you. We can take one question before the speakers can answer. Please.
Good afternoon. I'm Renzo Ginto from the Philippines. Based from your examples, you have showed how science diplomacy and or health diplomacy can be developed at the national level in terms of creating networks, strategies, etc. Now I'm curious about how can we develop diplomatic skills at the individual level? For example, for scientists or public health practitioners, how can we prepare them to be able to negotiate for better global health or to be able to better manage such collaborative activities? So should it be in a formal education setting, or, I'm just putting these ideas on the table. Maybe you have some suggestions. Thanks.
Okay. Can you start to comment?
Yeah, I was going to respond initially to the question about antibiotic resistance, and we can talk about the second question afterwards. I think it's a very important topic. for a variety of reasons. Obviously, in the case of HIV, it can drive the epidemic. And so we need to have tools in place to monitor the resistance. But it goes well beyond HIV. It goes to different bacterial and antibiotic resistance as well. So I think we probably need 2 or 3 things to be more effective in this space. One is clearly we need more antibiotics against different targets. That's a little bit of a hard sell, at least to the pharma industry, because the experience has been you develop a new antibiotic, you develop more resistance, and so you really would love to get some more permanent solution. That's where innovation, I think, could really kick in. We're learning a lot more about basic mechanisms by which bacteria, evolve this capacity to become resistant to just about anything. So I do think we do need more science to define better targets and more effective targets. I think we also do need the surveillance. And then I think we probably need something that goes even one step farther, which I find interesting, and that is that you often will find that antibiotic resistance is relatively regional. So in other words, it makes sense if you have certain antibiotics that are used in one country and they're not used so much in another country, then the organisms are sensitive to the antibiotics that haven't been taken to the first country yet. So having the capacity to move them around, to do the surveillance, could at least help us put out some fires when they occur. So I think it's a very important. The last issue in that area relates to the regulatory incentives, and again, the regulators can make it easier to develop new antibiotics. That's been done with the FDA recently through the GAIN Act. So making it simpler to get new drugs on the market will also improve our ability to respond more effectively. So, I think there are a number of things that can be done to respond to that.
Yeah, let me add to that. I agree that this is one of the big issues for the future, and we can envisage catastrophic type of scenarios where surgery becomes very difficult and some bone marrow transplantation and all this. So I think this calls for a real concerted action, and it is on numerous higher agendas, And 2 weeks ago, I was at a meeting at the Chatham House, had organized a special 2 days on this issue from the particular perspective of international collaboration and how to develop incentives and so on. And so it's clear that we need incentives for innovation, but also, more regulation. A lot of the problems come not from human medicine, but from agriculture, from the poultry industry and all that. And that is a very big issue, where the commercial and political interests are enormous. Farmers are a very powerful constituency in many countries. So that's really more of a national issue. Still surveillance, but then also a lot of we have the supply, to say so, new innovation, but on the other hand, we can also slow down the emergence of resistance, and that requires massive educational efforts, discipline in a sense, to use an old-fashioned word, but in prescription and so on. So that's, I think it's a complex issue, but I'm glad it's finally on the agenda. In terms of the second question, I think that was mentioned by, I can't remember, Gary, I think, about engagement with the public engagement. Now, in the UK, our most of the research funders, they make it a condition that as an institution, you have an active public engagement policy and practice. And for example, at our school, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, we offer media training to scientists, we coach them, we have an active program for engagement with the public and also with policymakers. These things don't happen spontaneously. Very few people are born with that kind of talent, but one can nurture it. And also the Royal Society, the Academy of Medical Sciences in the UK, we have, very proactive programs. And I think that will generate, a generation of scientists who are better equipped to interact with that world, which is different. I remember when I had my first media training many years ago, there was a professional journalist, and the first thing he told me was, start with a conclusion. And I was shocked. It went against my whole education, where you say, what's the problem? This is the methodology, that's what we found, and that's how we interpret things. By that time, they've switched to another channel, of course. So it is a very different skill, but we can learn that. And I think it's not solving the problem, but I think it can contribute. And I'm really impressed by the fact that this is an integral part now of science funding, at least in the UK. And I hope that that would be the case in other parts, in other countries as well.
More comments?
I would just add one thing. I think that researchers do not need training to interact with other researchers. I think your example from two people from the Lebanon and from Israel working at the same bench is a very good one. I think it shows clearly that researchers in most of the cases are very willing and able to cooperate in their field and don't need training in how to interact with other researchers. But I agree with this bridging research and practice, or research and communities. This is a different issue.
More comment? Please.
I think for the second question, individual, how to considering the health diploma. I think, for example, if you do innovation, of course you need to know what is the global level. Maybe something people already did that, and you should review all this literature to see the global level for the innovation. And also for the, the individual, the think about the global level. Because health, it is not only one country can control these kind of diseases, because they will suddenly all over the world. So you should considering how your work can contribute to the global level. For example, now called global health. Our university have the one group of people to do that. They help capacity building, not only China, also accept the summer vacation will accept all these other countries, they can come to get the training program. So I think for individual, just in your idea, should considering what is global level. For example, I did a research work is about use the laser to the vessel. They said can dealing with stroke, dealing with heart attack. And so they propose use this method, and the FDA, China, proved that. So all the community health center, they do it. The expert from this area, they said no useful. So then have some argue, and the Ministry of Health say stop. But the Ministry of the commercial and the industry, they said we should do it. So then they asked us to do health technology assessment, if this is useful or not. Then we review the literature. Actually, at an early stage, Russia and America, Canada, they all do it. But now they all did not do it because it is not useful. So I think these kind of things is individual, should consider what is a global experience and what is, it is the technology is good or not. Then you're considering yourself how to practice. This is my idea.
Thank you. It's time to finish, and so in my name is Steve. We ask the audience to applaud our excellent presentation of our speaker.